Welcome to the Simple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. I'm your host, Shannon Ables, and whether you're listening on your commute, exercising, working in the garden, or sitting down with a hot cup of tea or a cafe au lait, thank you for tuning in. Let's get started. Welcome to the 155th episode of the Simple Sophisticate. None other than Julia Child is our inspiration for today's episode. And we're just going to walk through some of her words and derive some life lessons from them that we can all apply to our lives, whether we enjoy cooking or not, whether we want to step into that kitchen or not, whether we love France or not. All of this is applicable no matter where or what we are trying to do, where we're trying to go, what we're trying to achieve. But before I get into that, today's Petite Please is a sweet, simple, chocolatey treat that is intimidating initially when we look at what it is, when we hear the name of it. But after having completed this recipe myself last week, I just had to say to myself, what have you waited for? Why haven't you done this sooner? This is so simple and so delicious and saves a lot of money too. Anyways, stay tuned until the end of today's episode where I'll reveal that simple, sweet, chocolatey recipe. Two other business notes that I'd like to share with you today. Just a reminder, as I announced last week on the 154th episode, June 26th will be an Ask Shannon episode. So I will be answering your questions on the air on that episode. And I want to say thank you to those who have already sent me your questions. I look forward to diving into them, and I am still accepting and wanting more questions about anything simply luxurious. Style, travel, France, kitchen, clothing, thoughts, mind, utilizing the skills and tools, and how to live the everyday simply luxuriously. If I can answer it, I sure will on the air. And I look forward to getting to know you, the listeners of the Simple Sophisticate podcast, a little bit better. So make sure that you send via email, askshannon@thesimplyluxuriouslife.com. That's all one word and double N, ASKSHANNON at thesimplyluxuriouslife.com. And you're welcome also to send an audio clip if you would like to share it that way as well. It's up to you. Either way, we'll get you on the air if it's a question I can answer. So looking forward to seeing what you are curious about. And last but not least, before we get into today's episode, I want to do a quick shout out and thank you to an Instagram follower of the Simply Luxurious Life. And it's a shout out from Christar45, who lives in Melbourne, Australia. And I think I said that wrong, so I apologize. She tunes in on her way to work while she is driving. And I just want to say thank you for tuning in all the way across the world in the fall season as we're experiencing spring here in the States. So thank you for tuning in, Christar45. And if you too are enjoying this podcast, your reviews mean so much and they help us out tremendously. So feel free to give a review on iTunes, shout out on Twitter, or shout out on Instagram. You can follow me on Instagram, The Simply Luxurious Life, or on Twitter, Simply Luxurious. And maybe your shout out will appear on a future episode. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. So let's get into this. It's a Francophile episode, but doesn't have to be for just those Francophiles. Let's get started. The more I read about Julia Child, especially in her own words, the more I find inspiration regarding how to successfully journey through life. Now, I have many more of her books and cookbooks to get through, but I've read quite a few memoirs by her and biographies as well. But it was the book My Life in France, which was recently a Petite Please here on the podcast, episode 152, that has just been tickling my mind. I cannot seem to get it out. She writes beautifully. You are taken back into this woman's time of her life when things, whether she knew it or not, were changing and changing in a powerful way for her future. And the key thing was that she was following her intuition. She was doing what she loved. She was living a life that she loved. She was being curious, and she refused to say no to things she didn't understand, and she just kept trying to figure them out. And so it's her saying yes to life and remaining curious and refusing to be intimidated by obstacles and unknowns and not knowing how to do something that we all could probably learn something from Julia Child, whether we enjoy cooking or just eating good food. And the lessons she provides are applicable in every arena of our lives. As I mentioned, I've read and loved My Life in France, and I wanted to come up with a list of some of the life lessons that were unearthed about how to navigate each of our journeys successfully in Julia's own words. Today I'm sharing with you 6, but I know there are far more. If the list intrigues you, I highly recommend picking up her memoir, which was published just after her death, as she herself, along with her nephew, had completed it just prior to her passing. So let's just dive right into this, and I'll kind of give some commentary along the way that I discovered as I was reading the book. Number 1, listen to what stirs you. When a passion worth pursuing presents itself, you'll know. A quote from Julia. Now that I had started writing, I found cookbookery such fulfilling work that I intended to keep at it for years and years. And I've shared this quote before, but it was her aha that I know feeling that she did come across, and she stuck with it, as we know, from then on. She just listened to herself. And I think that was a big takeaway for me, because there weren't a lot of cookbook writers at that time. There were definitely not American cooks writing about French cooking, but something spoke to her. Something was awoken, and she didn't ignore it. And I think that's the part of life that's scary, but also the key. To listen and step forward without having all the answers planned out. And if Julia Child exemplifies that it is worth it, what more evidence do we need? So that's number 1. Listen to what stirs you. When a passion worth pursuing presents itself, you'll know. Number 2, if we choose to, we can change. Here's a quote from the book. After driving to Rouen, we stopped in for lunch at La Corion, where we ordered exactly the same meal that we'd had on my first day in France, more than 2.5 years earlier. Oysters, sole meunière, salade verte, fromage blanc, and café filter. Ah, me! The meal was just as sublime the second time around, only now I could identify the smells in the air quicker than Paul, order my own food without help, and truly appreciate the artistry of the kitchen. La Corion was the same, but I had become a different person. And as you read through this memoir, you do see her progress and evolve and change, and you hear the excitement in her words as she's learning. You also hear her frustrations, and she dives into those as well, and the obstacles she runs up against, but she never stops. She never stops. She fell in love with France nearly the moment she arrived, aside from the fact that they were seasick when she first arrived on the land, terra firma of France. But she learns the language, she learns to cook, she gets to know the people, as we know, and in time, she does change and become this person that has figured out her journey, figured out her direction. So that was number 2. If we choose to, we can change. Number 3, self-doubt is natural and a sign that you truly care about what you are trying to do. Continue to push forward. Here's another quote from Julia. Ah, me. There was still so much to learn, and cooking was only half of it. I felt I'd have to teach at least 100 classes before I really knew what I was doing. What I love about this quote, in context, she is starting her small cooking class there in Paris that you see depicted on the show Julie and Julia by Nora Ephron. And Her husband has been a teacher for 16, 17 years. Up until this point, he hasn't been a teacher, but in the past, he had been a teacher for about 17 years. And he's giving her advice that you have to be confident when you speak and you have to convey this knowledge, that you have all this knowledge. And her immediate response to that was, but I know I don't know everything. And I want to make sure they know I don't know everything, but I want to learn what I don't know. And I just love that honesty about her. Obviously, she acquires a lot of knowledge along the way, and this is in the early stages, but her honesty was very forthcoming. And she knew that she had a lot to learn, but she wanted to continue to learn. And it was that doubt that I think we need to harness and see as a beacon in a way that's telling us this is something you're passionate about. You want to learn more. And because you want to learn more, you know there's a lot you don't know, but you want to go down this journey. So self-doubt is just, in many ways, the best thing to see, because it says to you, I really do want this. This is something I want to do well. And so it's not something that should stop you. It's something that should just remind you, hey, you do have more things to learn, but you know what? You're going in the right direction. You're doing something you're passionate about. Now just take the time to get to know and have patience with yourself. So that's number 3. Self-doubt is natural. Number 4, often the first rejection is a test to determine your true desire. Quote, I sighed. It just might be that the book was unpublishable. I wasn't feeling sorry for myself. I had gotten the job done. I was proud of it. And now I had a whole batch of foolproof recipes to use. Besides, I had found myself through the arduous writing process. Even if we were never able to publish our book, I had discovered my raison d'etre in life and would continue my self-training and teaching. This was one of the first rounds. I think it was the actual first round of the publisher turning down the book because it was too large and too much for what the publishing house in America, Hufflin Mifflin, thought that an American cook would actually want to buy. But she didn't see it as a huge defeat. Yes, of course, it was defeat. And I think they portray that in the film because they can't cover every single every single step of the process. But if you read the book, you see that she immediately does what she says right here. She saw all the gifts and the good stuff that came out of the process. She had, as we know, these foolproof recipes that we eventually do get to see. She had tested them ad nauseum until she knew they would work. And then she sat back and figured out what she was going to do next. It wasn't a deterrent. It was something that led her down the path, continued to lead her down the path that she wanted to follow. And that first rejection is just a way of saying, do you really want this? Because if you don't, it's easy to go to something else. But if you do, who knows what's next? And as we know, we all know what's next for Julia Child. She has quite the success. After many years, as we know, it does take many years. But I do think that life at times tries to test us. And I think Julia Child's first initial attempts at trying to get her book published with her 2 co-writers is a reminder that oftentimes that's going to happen, especially if it's something that's a little bit different, a little bit new. So that's number 4. Often the first rejection is a test to determine your true desire. Number 5, the key to delicious food is quality ingredients. Quote, this is the kind of food I had fallen in love with. Not trendy, souped up fantasies, just something very good to eat. It was classic French cooking, where the ingredients have been carefully selected and beautifully and knowingly prepared. Or in the words of the famous gastronome Kernonsky, food that tastes of what it is. As we know with the French culture, with at least what we've talked about here on the podcast and in many other books, and especially in Julia Child's tome, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, it's the ingredients that make the difference in the dish. Quality seasonal ingredients. And that's not easy, especially when we look at it through the lens of, okay, what's available now? If I am living in a particular part of the world, what can I cook now that's fresh? And do I have a recipe for that? And how do I do that? and also involves us knowing the fundamentals of cooking, which takes time to learn. But once we have those and we have that knowledge, it is a process. It does take time. Julia Child was not someone who knew how to cook when she came to Paris. Her curiosity led her to go get the education that she was curious about, and her time and tenacity in the kitchen practicing is what made her the cook she became. It didn't just happen overnight. She wanted to become better. And I think we don't have to spend as much time as Julia Child did, because most of us are probably not going to be writing cookbooks. But we can learn so that we can have more pleasure and enjoyment in the kitchen, not only as we're making it with the knowing that we know how to cook, but in tasting that food and knowing it's delicious and serving delicious food. Because it doesn't always have to be uber complicated if we know the basics and we know we have quality ingredients. On that note, I want to make a quick show note here. If you've been following me on Instagram, over the last weekend, I was finishing up the capsule spring menu, and it is about to come out to help you with just what we're talking about here. I already created a fall capsule menu, and and I'll provide a link to it on today's show notes. But the spring capsule menu is about to come out to help you cook delicious meals throughout the week, versatile menu so that you're mixing and matching different ingredients. You're not buying a ton of ingredients, but you're also utilizing what's fresh and in the season. And they're not uber difficult recipes, simple and delicious. So that's coming out in the next 2 weeks. So be sure to stay tuned for that. And the last life lesson from Julia Child, from her book, My Life in France, is time, perseverance, and asking for help from experts does pay off. It would eventually take us 2 years and something like 284 pounds of flour to try out all the home-style recipes for French bread we could find. This is when she says we, she means Paul and herself. We used 2 French textbooks on baking and tutored ourselves on the fine points of yeasts and flours, yet our best efforts still fell short. One day I read a newspaper article about Professor Raymond Calvel, an eminent baker and teacher at l'École Française des Meineries. Professor Calvel showed us what we'd been doing wrong and taught us all about making proper French bread. By the end of the day, our loaves were turning out just right, and I was feeling euphoric. It was as though the sun in all its glory had suddenly broken through the shades of gloom. Now, this testing was for her second volume of Mastering the Art of French Cooking, of which I'll put a link on today's show notes. Because in the first, they didn't have those bread recipes, but her editor, Judith Jones, basically told Julia, this is a French cookbook. You need to have these recipes. People are looking for those recipes. And so Julia, as you see here, spent years and a lot of dollars and a lot of time trying to figure out how us, the home cook, could make that French bread like we would pick up in a French bakery. And I think that's been a huge takeaway for me from this book. She was not an overnight success. It didn't happen because she wanted to make it happen, in the sense of, well, this will be easy. Number one, she didn't know how it was all going to turn out. She just did what she loved. I think that's the important part. But she put in the time. She perfected these recipes. She did all the grunt work and made all the mistakes for us, and so that we can trust what we're doing with her recipes. That is why it's a classic cookbook. That is why it is something that people revere. It's worthy of that. And I also think that her willingness to seek out experts is telling, because she goes to the people that know more than she does. She's not afraid to say, hey, you are wise on this. You have time and expertise. What can I learn from you? What are you willing to share with me? Are you willing to share? And if you are, tell me what you want me to do. I think that's a great lesson, not just for learning how to make French bread, but for anything in life. Again, this is a beautiful book, and she also goes into her experience of the creation of the French Chef, which aired on PBS, and the making of those episodes, being a pioneer in the food television industry, as we call it now. I'll provide a link to that book on the show notes, the simplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 155. And I have a few other posts I think you might enjoy as well, inspired by Julia, at least a few of them. Go inside her Provence home that she and Paul built, and you can now rent it on Airbnb for your next vacation. Did you know that? Just knowing that the key really is finding a passion for life. And it doesn't have to be something very specific, I don't think, like cookbookery, but having something you're passionate about is what is the fuel, and having that endless curiosity, which she did. Those are the 6 life lessons from Julia Child. I do hope you enjoy. And I'll be right back with this week's Petite Plaisir. All right, welcome back. This week's Petite Plaisir is a simple, sweet chocolate treat. We're talking about dark chocolate truffles, and you can make your own. I honestly had never made dark chocolate truffles before. I have purchased a lot of them, as many of my readers and listeners know. It's one of my evening rituals to nibble on a dark chocolate truffle with my tea in the evening when I don't eat dessert. But I haven't ever made my own, and I don't know why I haven't, because now that I know how simple it is, it will be happening more often. But I was inspired after going through Patricia Wells' new cookbook, My Master Recipes, and I pulled out her recipe and played a little bit with it, and this is what I came up with. It is a process that you want to plan the day before, that you want to make them for dessert or for a treat or whatever, because you're going to have to let it just sit out on the counter for a few hours, preferably overnight. That's the only thing that takes time. The rest is so simple, so simple. And the key, again, as we just mentioned in the episode today about Julia Child, is quality ingredients. So all you do the night before is coarsely chop up the chocolate. You want 7 ounces of bittersweet chocolate, at least 70% cacao. And I recommend, there are a handful of different brands you can check out, but I've shared my favorites on the recipe on the show notes. And you place the chocolate in a medium metal bowl. I put mine in a copper pot and just set that aside for a moment. You're going to mix up a small little mixture to pour on that chocolate that will melt it. So in a saucepan, you want to pour cream and honey, and you want about 2/3 cup cream and 1 tablespoon honey. Heat that up on low heat until it comes just barely to a boil. And so basically you're just warming it up, making sure it's all mixed up. And then you immediately pour 1/3 of that mixture, that's of honey and cream, over the chocolate in the metal bowl. And you want to work really quickly with a spatula mixing it up, because you're trying to melt that chocolate right from the heat of the mixture. And so as it's beginning to gain that glossy and smooth finish, pour the rest of the cream until it all emulsifies and it's completely melted and completely smooth. And then you add 1 tablespoon of unsalted butter. There's still warmth in that chocolate mixture, and you want to use that warmth to melt that butter into the chocolate. And you mix until everything is completely incorporated and you have this lovely glossy ganache. That's ganache. That's all it is. It's so simple. I was so excited. You can see how mine turned out in the pictures in the recipe. But you literally just set the bowl aside for a little bit to get it to room temperature. Don't put anything on it. Just set it aside. And then once it's cool and it's at room temperature, put plastic wrap over the top of it and set it aside. Don't put it in the refrigerator. Just set it aside for several hours, or best bet, just do it for an entire night. That's what I did, and you'll see how it looked in the morning in the picture after the 5th step of instructions for making the ganache. All right, so the good news here, though, you can actually refrigerate the ganache up to 2 days, so if you need to do it ahead of time, you absolutely can. And then you make the balls, the truffle balls, and you want to make sure you serve them at room temperature. So you may make them right before you want to serve them, because they'll be at room temperature. But maybe you're making them ahead of time, and they can be saved in the refrigerator for up to 1 week. So either way, it works, and it's a simple process. So you're going to get, I like using a small ice cream scoop that has a lever on it that will then take the chocolate out. It's up to you. You don't have to do that. You can just get an ice cream scoop that doesn't manually take it out with a spoon and then roll it in your hands. But I was using an ice cream scoop out about a 1 inch amount that's going to roll into a 1 inch ball. roll it into your hand until it's a smooth ball. And then in a bowl with a wire sieve on top, you're going to put the truffle in the sieve and dash a little bit of unsweetened cocoa powder on top of it. You're going to use about 3 to 5 tablespoons of cocoa powder. There's a lot of ways you can do this. I found that was the first way I did it. I put the round ball in the sieve and then kind of just dusted a little bit of chocolate on it and then rolled it around. But then what I found best worked after I had some chocolate powder in the bowl that had gone through the sieve is to just roll the balls around in the bowl, have it pick up the chocolate powder, and then put it in the sieve to shake off any excess. And that's all you do for all of the truffle balls, and you're done. So after that point, you can either serve them because they'll be at room temperature, or you can put them in the refrigerator up to a week. That's it. You have dark chocolate truffles. How easy is that? I'm not trying to quote Barefoot Contessa, but it really is. But that was in the book that I highly recommend you picking up, My Master Recipes by Patricia Wells. She organizes her cookbook by skill. So she'll give you a master recipe for, in this case, how to work with chocolate. But she also does blanching and broiling and basting and roasting, all the different skills. She'll give you a master recipe, and then she'll give you a few more ways to play with the recipe, which I think is fantastic. And she talks you through the skill, which is what we were just talking about when we're talking about Julia Child. She learned the skills, and then she could have some fun with those skills, making different recipes that she wanted. So I think you'll enjoy it. They're delicious, and you really will be completely satiated with one because of that quality chocolate. So you'll find the recipe on the show notes, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 155. I hope you've enjoyed this week's Petite Please, where each week ideas are shared to make the everyday all the more enjoyable. Tune in at the end of each Monday's podcast where I'll recommend a book, a film, or a recipe, anything that is a simple pleasure to satiate your sophisticated taste. Thank you for tuning in to the Simple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. For more ideas and inspiration throughout the week, stop by the blog, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com, or pick up the book, Choosing the Simply Luxurious Life, A Modern Woman's Guide. To stay caught up on the most recent podcasts, blog posts, and receive exclusive news as well as an extra dose of inspiration, subscribe to the Simply Luxurious Life's weekly newsletter, which arrives in your inbox each Friday to enjoy with a hot cup of tea or your morning coffee, just in time to jumpstart the weekend. Until next Monday, I'm your host, Shannon Ables. Bonne journée!